Fish 27. Marriage and the family. Marriage, demarcated. Marriage is the contractual union of a man with one or more women, primarily for the purpose of procreation and child rearing, irrespective of whether or not any progeny ultimately ensues from the union. In other words, marriage is simply a term given to the concept of human mating conventions, seeing that the mating customs of human beings are far more involved than those of non-human animals. However, no matter the complexity of human marriage rites, rituals, and connubial customs, one can never deny the blatantly obvious fact that marriage is essentially a word that we have ascribed to the mating mores of the Homo sapiens species, and explaining the reason why, in many cultures, a marriage is considered to not be finalized, if it has yet to be sexually consummated. Unless one happens to believe the infantile fairy tale, that humans were fashioned out of clay by the big guy upstairs, God, it is reasonable to assume, by the processes of deduction, induction, and abduction, that the institution of marriage evolved in our species, from a primitive mate selection system, similar to that of modern apes, to our present-day marriage conventions, involving a superfluity of elaborate social protocols, rules, regulations, and even naive superstitions. Therefore, it is simply nonsensical, and downright evil, to impute matrimony to homosexual unions. See the following chapter in this regard. For those with a sophistic mindset, note that the above facts clearly apply to any foreign language translation of the English word, marriage. In the case of a couple entering marriage with the knowledge that one or both parties are infertile, or in the case of those couples who, for sincere reasons, simply do not wish to reproduce, the secondary purposes of matrimony, indicated below, should be observed. The fact that progeny do not, or cannot, ensue from such a union, does not negate its validity. Of course, a childless couple has the option to either adopt orphans, or to raise, or partially raise, a child of a close relative, the latter of which is not uncommon in certain cultures, such as here in the Philippines, where the average number of children per family, until the 1980s, was 6 offspring per couple, and young children are often raised or partially raised by relatives. In the case of the millions of single mothers extant in Pilipinas, the maternal grandmother is typically employed. It is immoral for homosexual couples to raise children, unless there are no married couples willing and able to care for the children in question, which would be extremely unlikely in any scenario short of an apocalyptic event. In order for children to grow into well-adjusted adults, able to produce subsequent generations of wholesome human beings, both masculine and feminine parental role models are utterly indispensable. But polygamy is bad. Polygamy has been taught by all the major religious traditions. Unfortunately, the westernized religious cults seem to have done away with this practice, for unbeknown reasons. The rationale for polygamy is simply due to the fact that every woman needs a husband, and a certain proportion of men are destined to die as bachelors, due to female hypergamy, which is a natural trait of women, even if it may seem unfair. As a general rule, men who belong to the business, landlord class of society, and monarchs, alone have the concession to practice polygamy, because, as any married man will acknowledge, a woman is, in practically every instance, extremely demanding of one's material resources. Of course, any stray feminist who may happen to be reading this chapter would undoubtedly contest the above claim, that every woman needs a man, but if one is truly wise, after reading the entirety of this holy scripture, and understanding the vulnerable position of any single woman in our unsafe society, and how society is best organized and structured, one should be more amenable to this very sensible assertion. A certain percentage of the general population, mostly women, it seems, since very few men would reject multiple sexual partners, has an instinctual revulsion to the notion of polygamy, considering the practice to be either objectively immoral, or simply repulsive, from a purely emotional position. Even though women are generally much more opposed to polygamy than are men, undoubtedly, the female members of society are far more greatly benefited from polygamous unions. Firstly, as already mentioned in the previous paragraph, a woman and her offspring are very taxing on a man's time and his resources, so the only possible advantage to a man marrying more than a single spouse could be that he has more women to fuck, and to perform his domestic duties, and of course, the more wives and children one has, the more chores are required, so the law of diminishing returns comes into play here. Secondly, how many women would prefer to wed an utterly poor, poverty-stricken laborer or beggar, within a monogamous relationship, rather than marry an extraordinarily wealthy business tycoon, within a polygamous state of affairs? Very few, if any, since hypergamy is a deep-rooted sociological phenomenon that cannot easily be restrained. Despite polygamy being practiced in ancient Israel, and condoned in the Old Testament, it has become exceedingly rare in the modern era. Although the Hebrew scriptures describe numerous examples of polygynous, one male with multiple wives, instances of polygamy among devotees of God, most Christian groups have historically rejected the practice of polygamy, and have upheld monogamy alone as normative. For example, according to the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, polygamy is not in accord with the moral law, as it directly negates the plan of God, because it is contrary to the equal personal dignity of men and women, who in matrimony give themselves with a love that is total and therefore unique and exclusive. Notwithstanding the several glaringly incorrect theological and ontological errors in the above proclamations, the Church asserts, the Christian who has previously lived in polygamy has a grave duty in justice to honor the obligations contracted in regard to his former wives and to his children, which is an inherently paradoxical statement, since, if a man is to honor the obligations in regard to his former wives, they would not, in fact, be former wives, but they would still be his current wives. Anyway, the entire objection to a legitimately contracted polygynous union is nothing but a farcical exercise, because there can be no valid objection to it. N.B. Those who are intimately familiar with all the precepts of this holiest of all holy scriptures, who am I kidding? This is the only truly holy book that has ever been composed, will notice that, in the subtitle of this section, I have used the term bad, even though I have repeatedly stated that the terms good and bad are never to be used in relation to moral judgments. Obviously, the subtitle is a quotation from an anti-polygamist, such as the typical jealous female and/or feminist, declaring her objection to the holy institution of polygamy. The mere fact that one may be asserting the opinion that polygamy is bad, or wrong, is simply one small morsel of evidence that the anti-polygamy position is imperfect, if not totally incorrect, because the notions of good and bad are nonsensical in relation to morality, as more than adequately demonstrated in Chapter 12 of this treatise. In brief, the terms good and bad are utterly meaningless, unless they are accompanied by an established axiom. Is a screwdriver good or is it bad? That depends on its intended purpose. If it is to be used for turning a screw, it is good, but if it is to be used to hammer a nail, it is bad. So, anyone who claims that polygamy is bad is required to tender the maxim upon which his or her assertion is founded, and since almost no person in the history of humanity is truly expert in law, dharma, in Sanskrit, any attempt to do so will invariably fail dismally, truth be told. The same paradigm applies also to those anti-polygamists who use wrong in lieu of bad. The marital arrangement and compatibility. The couple asterisk should be brought together by their respective parents, and optionally, some sort of public nuptial ceremony performed. Once the couple has been engaged to be married, they should not break the agreement, unless one party has been proven to have lost his or her virginity with a third party. Obviously, after the wedding, the marriage contract cannot be legally broken, unless one or both parties has committed adultery, or one party has chosen to no longer carry out his or her marital duties. For instance, if the husband refuses to materially support his wife, or the wife refuses to perform domestic chores for her master, both of which are lawful grounds for divorce. See also the entries divorce, law, and legal in the glossary. Therefore, the widespread belief that marriage is the issuance of a government license or certificate to two persons who happen to have fallen in love is totally and utterly alien to the facts of the matter, as well as to the practice of matrimonial norms for virtually the entirety of human history, and undoubtedly, prehistory. Government indoctrination is to blame for this. A responsible father will objectively evaluate the peculiar characteristics, virtues, idiosyncrasies, and shortcomings of his child, Ren, from a relatively early age, and thereafter, seek a compatible spouse from the pool of available mates in his social circles. Unless his nation faces annihilation, the potential match should not be any closer to his child than a cousin. If a prospective couple do not belong to the same clan, and thereby do not share the same family name, it is probable that their genotypes are sufficiently divergent to create healthy offspring. An incestuous marriage should be condoned only if the human race is in danger of extermination, or possibly in the instance where an entire race or nation is on the verge of extinction. After all, it has been shown that all extant humans are the product of a genetically unique matriarch. If one's parents fail in the duty to select a suitable mate, one should very carefully choose a compatible spouse. The recommended criteria used to evaluate marital compatibility are as follows: physical characteristics, such as relative height and sexual attractiveness, personality type, level of intelligence, emotional temperament, diet, cultural similarities, political affiliation, religious creed, and life goals. Unfortunately, in the current age, particularly in the Western countries and those nations that have become almost fully westernized, even if a man tries his level best to find a compatible spouse, there is a good chance that his wife will abandon him for any trivial reason, usually, however, for financial reasons. When I married my two, now former, Filipino wives, I failed to fathom just how powerful was the greed of the typical woman, especially those from nations that are considered third world. Of course, now, as an elderly monastic, I can very clearly see the nature of the typical female, and am excruciatingly careful in my dealings with the opposite gender. Not that all men are completely free of greed, of course, but that particular vice is rarely the cause of marriage breakdowns from the male perspective. The main reason for men leaving their wives is due to becoming infatuated with another woman, which simply proves that polygamy ought not be frustrated. If those men who were inclined towards polygyny were not thwarted in the desires, their marriages would not need to end in a miserable divorce. One of the major causes of conjugal breakdowns in recent decades has been due to men and women coupling based solely, or at least, predominantly, on sexual attraction and/or amorous attachments, with little consideration given to the other guiding principles listed above. Romance rarely lasts more than a couple of years. Marriage is an institution based largely on practical considerations, not on lustful feelings or on fleeting sentimentality. Without firm, practical reasons for a couple remaining conjugally bound, they are susceptible to marital divorce. The man should be approximately 10 to 20 years older than his wives. Some of the reasons for this are: it is natural for women to be attracted to older men and for men to be attracted to younger women. There is a good evolutionary reason why women reach their sexual peak between the ages of about 15 to 25, and reasons why a man's sexual market value peaks in his 30s to 50s. The female matures earlier, both physically and socially, so if she mates with a man of similar age, she may find her spouse to be emotionally immature. The husband is almost a substitute for the woman's father figure, so the husband's age gives him added authority as head of the family. Also, it gives the man extra time to establish his career, a house and a home for his wife and their forthcoming progeny. The biological imperatives. Generally speaking, women have the potent desire to raise children, and require a man with whom to mate, and then protect and support her and the offspring, during the 15+ years, for each child, of child rearing. Most men desire also to have a family, and additionally, possess a very powerful libido, which, if not channeled in a legitimate fashion, can cause a great deal of social misbehavior, e.g. rape, etc. There is no such thing as a nun in the eyes of God. Therefore, unless a woman is seriously disabled, either physically or psychologically, or else, she is a lesbian, she is lawfully obligated to marry the man preselected by her parents, or if her parents are deceased, by her extant master, whether that be her grandfather, an uncle, or an elder brother. Ideally, women ought to be betrothed as soon as they reach adulthood, to avoid a childless existence. Quite understandably, very few men have aspirations to mate with a postmenopausal female, read, cat lady. Marriage is mandatory for men too, apart from missionary priests, those unfortunate males who are unable to support a family for reasons of mental or physical incapacity, those men who are simply passed over by hypergamous females, due to being perceived as low-value suitors, homosexuals, meaning, men who are not at all attracted to the opposite gender, bisexuals are not exempt from marriage, and men who reside in jurisdictions where illegitimate feministic governments enact so-called laws that abrogate the legitimate rights of married men. In my particular case, despite being a model husband and father, my first adulterous, so-called wife, with the support of the dirty, demonic, democratic Australian government, metaphorically abducted my 3 precious children, whilst my second adulterous, so-called wife, with the assistance of the equally wicked, violent, corrupt, illegitimate, murderous Filipino government, stole my presbytery, the house of a priest. The recent exodus of men, in the Western countries especially, from the dating pool, or at least, avoiding formal marriage, is more than understandable. The only men who are relatively safe from possible persecution, simply for being married to a woman, are those men residing in nations where the so-called laws are founded upon ancient mores, especially Islamic law, though this exception is gradually changing. The marital duties. The main duties of the husband are to teach his wives and sons whatever beneficial lessons he has learnt from his own masters, protect his family from harm, and supply their necessities of life, that is, food, clothing, and shelter, and if practicable, and they are deserving, various desired luxuries. The English noun, husband, comes from the Old Norse word, husbandi, meaning, master of the house. Consequently, marriage is not a democracy. Any so-called man, who compromises with his subordinates, whether they be his wives, or his offspring, is surely doomed to failure. Feminized Western men, in particular, are guilty of such uxoriousness, though even most Asian men are becoming feminized nowadays. Such emasculated men are not true men, and they desperately need to regain the dignity as the head of their homes. The main daily duties of the wife are to execute domestic chores, such as to cook, clean, sew, take care of the children, and to keep the husband sexually satisfied so that he does not become tempted to seek sexual pleasure outside of the marital union, which is a capital offense. The wife should submit to the will of her husband. She should fully respect him as her master, and she should always address him accordingly. Whilst conversing, the wife should focus her attention completely on her husband. She should listen carefully to what he says, learn what he is saying, politely answer him, and obey his instructions. A man should never be alone with any female, apart from his wives, of course. A woman's place in her new family, and divorce. When a woman marries, she literally joins the family of her husband, and no longer has any obligations to the family in which she was born. She takes her master's family name, and the husband's parents become her parents, which is why they are called father, mother-in-law, that is, father, mother according to the law, the one and only law of God, or more accurately, the universal law, as propounded in chapter 12. Conversely, if a woman divorces her Lord, God, and Master, she no longer retains any rights towards her previous family. She cannot legally, according to the inextricable moral law, dharma, in Sanskrit, take anything from her ex-husband's family, whether that be his property, including the children born of that union, or his family name. Unless her husband is guilty of adultery, she may take only whatever clothes she has on her body, and cannot return to her birth family, but is a loose woman. A noble man will, if approached by his former daughter, instruct her to promptly return to her husband and submit to his will, rather than take her back into his home. See also the glossary entry, divorce. Therefore, a divorced woman is to be referred to as her child's ex-mother, or former mother. Any person who considers the birth mother of a child to still be the child's mother, after divorcing herself from her master's family, is naught but a pathetic enabler of sinful behavior, unless, as previously stated, the husband was proven to be either an adulterer, or grossly negligent in his duties as the patriarch of his family. The extended family. As far as practical, newlyweds should reside in the house of their father, that is, the father of the groom, who is the bride's father according to the law. The benefits of this living arrangement greatly exceed any possible disadvantages, assuming, of course, that the father-son relationship is amiable. Women, in particular, need the comfort and support of being surrounded by extended family. When facing relationship difficulties, emotional distress, or medical problems, women require the counsel of elder females, such as the grandmother, mother-in-law, or an aunt. Although males generally do not feel the same need for close familial bonds, it is enormously beneficial for men to also maintain a strong relationship with their male kin. The storehouse of knowledge and wisdom preserved by the patriarchy is invaluable for any young man, no matter his level of intelligence or seeming sagacity. Also, if the husband dies or becomes severely disabled, his wife has a safe haven for herself and her offspring. Ideally, a widow should be cared for by a brother-in-law, or if her deceased husband was bereft of adult brethren, another male relative. Furthermore, there are significant financial advantages to an extended family dwelling in the same house, or at least in the immediate vicinity, which can never be discounted for the vast majority of families who are not blessed with an abundance of wealth. Just as the parents, ideally, spend decades of their lives lovingly raising their offspring, it is the sacred duty of adult male children to care for their elderly parents and, of course, any of their extant grandparents. If, for some reason, the sons are unwilling or unable to properly look after an aging parent, grandparent, that obligation will naturally fall to any other male relative. Accordingly, any adult male within the clan may take responsibility for the care of the aging couple, likewise, a disabled couple too, of course. There are exceptions to the rule that an heir ought to care for his elderly parents, specifically in the case where the son has joined the holy priesthood, especially if he has become a mendicant monk. When a man dies, any property that he may own, including his family members, automatically bequeaths to his eldest son. N.B. Above, where it is mentioned that the duty of care is placed upon a particular male relative, it should be understood that the actual daily tasks of caring for an aging parent do not necessarily fall upon him personally. For example, if the son is busy at work, his wife and/or daughters must care for their elders. Obviously, it is quite improper for a man to bathe and toilet his geriatric mother or his grandmother. Childbirth. Unless medical complications arise, the idyllic location for a pregnant woman to birth her child is in her family home, preferably midwifed by her mother-in-law and other female kin, typically, any girl or woman with whom she shares the same family name. Unless the mother is over the age of approximately 35, has an infection, or the baby is premature, underwater birthing is possibly the least stressful method of childbirth. This is best done in a properly disinfected bathtub, filled with lukewarm water, purified via the process of reverse osmosis. If possible, a qualified obstetrician should be consulted during the final trimester of pregnancy, in order to confirm whether or not home birthing is a safe option for the mother in question, and a physician kept on standby, to be contacted in case of a medical emergency during the birth. The parents, specifically, the father and/or the baby's grandfather, have the sole discretion to name their children, and unless one of their sons happens to grow to become a king or a priest, a child cannot at any time legally change his or her name without permission of his or her father, or father-in-law, in the case of a married woman. The reason why a monarch or a guru does not require parental permission to change his name is because those two classes of society have superior authority over their birth parents, unless, of course, their father is also a priest. As far as possible and practical, infants should breastfeed exclusively for at least the first 2 years, and subsequently, be slowly weaned with mashed fruits. The ideal human diet is fully explicated in the concluding chapter of this final instruction sheet for humanity, but for the benefit of those who are without access to chapter 30 of FISH, children, adolescents, as well as adults, thrive on fully raw, pure vegetarian foodstuffs, or at least on a mostly raw plant-based diet, for those residing outside the tropics. Furthermore, veganism is a moral imperative. Child-rearing. The two most important facets of child-rearing are discipline and affection. Apart from the obvious requirements of being properly fed, clothed, housed, and educated, children need, more than anything else, strict discipline, coupled with an enormous amount of love and affection. Discipline means to train one's child to obey rules or a code of behavior, using fitting punishment to correct any disobedience. Childhood trauma, caused by such issues as parental neglect, physical and/or sexual abuse, and divorce, invariably results in severe psychological problems later in life, which requires an inordinate amount of therapy to overcome. Unfortunately, very few such persons receive adequate treatment for the particular form of neurosis, which often results in them causing a menace to themselves and to others. Those who are unable to hire a qualified psychologist to help with their mental distress are advised to consult a competent yoga instructor, qualified in at least one of the 4 systems of religion, yoga, in Sanskrit, described in chapter 16 of this holiest of all holy scriptures. As children enter adolescence, they ought to be physically and psychologically prepared to face the demands of life as adults. Female offspring must be trained in the intricacies of life as a housewife and mother, whilst male offspring should be apprenticed in their chosen field of work, upon reaching adulthood at the age of 13, or for the small proportion of males with an entrepreneurial inclination, their careers as businessmen, and for an infinitesimally smaller percentage of men, to function as kings or as priests. See also the glossary entry for adult. Conclusion. The nuclear family, that is, a husband, his wife and their brood, is the basic social unit upon which any society is built. Thereafter, the extended family, too, is very important to the stability of human civilization. After carefully perusing the above precepts, it should be patently obvious that modern societies are ordered very far from the ideal in respect to family life, and that, unless individuals, organizations, and governments make concerted efforts to repair this foundational unit of society, the consummate destruction of human civilization is all but inevitable. Whosoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery, and for the man who marries a woman who has divorced herself from her husband, both he and the woman have committed adultery. The Gospel according to Luke, 16:18. Lord Jesus Christ, as quoted by Dr. Luke. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Psalm 127, 3-5 by King David. The Holy Bible. Educate your children to self-control, to the habit of holding passion and prejudice and evil tendencies subject to an upright and reasoning will, and you have done much to abolish misery from their future and crimes from society. Benjamin Franklin. American polymath. Raising children is, in a sense, the reason the society exists in the first place. It's the most important thing that happens, and it's the culmination of all the tools and language and social structure that has evolved. From The Lost World. Michael Crichton, American author. When marrying, ask yourself this question: do you believe that you will be able to converse well with this person into your old age? Everything else in marriage is transitory. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. German philosopher. There is nothing more admirable than when two people who see eye to eye, keep house as man and wife, confounding their enemies and delighting their friends. Homer. Ancient Greek poet. I have always thought that every woman should marry, and no man. Benjamin Disraeli. 1st Earl of Beaconsfield, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. In case one is curious to know the reason for the word couple being used in several places of this chapter, despite the fact that polygamy is a fully legitimate practice, it is due to the following. Firstly, when a woman is betrothed to wed a man who already has one or more wives, she does not marry the man's spouses obviously, she marries the man alone, and so, there is a coupling union taking place. The incoming wife is simply a new member of the family, similar to the welcoming of a newborn child into the clan. In fact, a good husband will treat his wives in a similar manner to his children, that is, with proper discipline, and disallow any deviant or disrespectful behavior, lest his wife becomes a threat to his position as the head of the house. Secondly, it would have broken the flow of the passage if, whenever the word couple was mentioned, the following phrase was inserted. The couple, or however many are united within the marriage union. Also, if, for example, one of a man's wives decides to divorce her husband, it is purely a matter between she and her master, again, a matter of coupling, and peripheral to any of the other wives present.